All right, so you're back with us, ready for more. You're the kind of person who loves to dig deep. And today, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to contemplate how we even arrive at what we think is true. Like, how do we form those beliefs that we hold so dear? And to do that, we've got to look at two key ways our minds work,
Huh?
the subjective and the objective.
Yeah. And, sometimes those two can feel miles apart, right? It's like, on one hand, we've got this inner world that's so influenced by what we hear, what we're told, what we just kind of absorb from the world around us. And on the other, we've got this capacity to analyze, to question, to really try to figure things out for ourselves based on evidence and logic.
And this distinction, this tension between the subjective and the objective, it's at the heart of what we're exploring today. We've got some fascinating material that digs into all this. It really makes you think about how beliefs take shape and how we can become more aware, more deliberate in that process.
Absolutely. And it all starts with this idea of the subjective mind. When we think about hypnosis, we often see it as this really altered state, something quite unusual. But the material we're looking at suggests that the way the mind behaves under hypnosis might actually reveal the normal, everyday operating mode of the subjective part of us. It's constantly taking in suggestions,
Mhm.
shaping itself based on what it receives.
That's a pretty radical idea, right? It's like our subjective mind is this incredibly receptive. Yeah,
Canvas.
like a canvas. And everything we encounter, every piece of information, every opinion, every belief that's floating around out there, it all has the potential to leave a mark on that canvas.
And what's crucial here, what this material really emphasizes, is that it's not just the content of those suggestions that matters, it's the source and the nature of them too. The subjective mind, it's not designed to be this super critical filter, right? It doesn't necessarily analyze or evaluate what it's given. Its primary function is to act in accordance with whatever is impressed upon it.
Okay, now that's huge because it means we need to pay attention not only to what we're thinking and believing, but also to where those thoughts and beliefs are coming from. It makes you really think about the influences in your life, the voices you're listening to.
For sure. And then this whole idea gets even bigger. The material introduces this concept of a universal subjective mind, which is described as an intelligent spirit that permeates all space and matter. It's like this fundamental creative power that's at work throughout all of nature.
Whoa. Okay, so we're talking universal now, like cosmic level stuff.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
mind-blowing, right? But think about it. If there is an origin to everything, a first cause, it would have to be purely subjective. It would have to be potentiality before it manifests into any kind of objective form. So this universal mind, as pure spirit, it must be subjective in nature.
Hmm, I'm following you. So we've got this subjective mind, both on a personal level and this vast universal level. And in both cases, the material we're looking at emphasizes its role as the builder. It even specifically calls it the builder of the body. And that's a powerful image, right? The idea that this creative power is working from within to shape and mold and heal us.
Yeah, it's like there's this inherent intelligence woven into the very fabric of existence. And the key principle that the material highlights is this. Wherever there's creative power at work, you will find subjective mind present. And if you think about the sheer complexity of the universe, the intricate way that everything unfolds, the way stars form and galaxies spin and life emerges and evolves, it makes you wonder if there really is this subjective, receptive intelligence at the heart of it all.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also incredibly inspiring, isn't it? To think that we might be connected to this vast creative force in some fundamental way.
Totally. And here's where it gets really interesting. This universal subjective mind, it has this really important characteristic. It's amenable to any suggestion, like anything. And what's more, it tends to carry out those suggestions to their most rigorously logical consequences.
Okay, hold on. So you're saying this creative force, this universal intelligence, it just acts on whatever's presented to it without any judgment, without questioning.
That's what this material is suggesting. It's like a fundamental law of the universe, a kind of cosmic cause and effect playing out on a grand scale. And that's why it's so important to understand the connection between this universal subjective mind and our own individual subjective minds.
So how exactly does that connection work?
Well, the material puts forward this idea that our individual subjective mind is like a personal share in the universal mind. It's not a literal division, like cutting up a pie. It's more like, imagine a vast ocean. And each of us is like a wave on that ocean. We're distinct, we have our own form and movement, but we're all ultimately part of that same body of water.
I like that analogy. It helps me visualize it. So our individual subjective minds are like these unique expressions of that one underlying universal mind.
Exactly. And this connection, it's what allows us to potentially tap into that vast creative power.
Okay, so that kind of addresses a question I was having. Because if this universal mind is the source of all creation, how do we, as individuals, actually participate in that creative process? How do we take our own desires, our own intentions, and bring them into reality?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And that's where the distinction between our subjective and objective minds becomes really important.
Right, because the objective mind, that's the part of us that observes the world, analyzes, tries to figure things out based on evidence,
Yeah.
and reasons logically. It's like the scientist in us.
Exactly. And the material we're looking at takes this a step further by calling the individual subjective mind the organ of the absolute and the objective mind the organ of the relative. Think of the absolute as the pure essence of something, like its fundamental potential, totally independent of any context or limitations. And the relative, on the other hand, is all about how things exist in relation to other things, how they're defined by their circumstances and boundaries.
So the absolute is the realm of causes, the underlying source of things, and the relative is the realm of conditions, the specific limitations and circumstances we encounter in the world.
Precisely. And here's the key. If we want to influence conditions, if we want to actually bring our desires into being, our thought power needs to operate on the level of the absolute. It needs to tap into that realm of pure potential. And the way we do that is through our subjective mind.
That's a powerful idea. So our subjective mind is the bridge between our individual intentions and this universal creative force. And the objective mind, while important for understanding the world around us, can actually become a kind of obstacle if we let it dominate our thinking.
Right, because the objective mind is so focused on what already exists, on the limitations and conditions we perceive. And if we're constantly thinking about those limitations, if we're letting our doubts and fears run the show, we're essentially blocking ourselves from accessing the full potential of our subjective mind.
So how do we actually shift our thinking to tap into that unlimited creative power?
Yeah.
How do we move an idea from this limited realm of the absolute relative to the unlimited realm of the absolute?
The material gives us a very specific approach. It says that to impress an idea onto the subjective mind in a way that truly activates its creative power, we need to do it apart from any limiting conditions. We need to think of the desired outcome as already existing, as a present moment reality, and that involves transcending our usual linear perception of time. I see. So if we're constantly dwelling on how something will happen or worrying about the obstacles that might get in our way, we're still operating in the realm of the relative and we're letting those conditions dictate our thinking.
Exactly. And to help us make this mental shift, the material introduces this idea of creating a spiritual prototype in the spiritual world. This prototype is like the essential being of whatever we desire. And the physical form we see manifest in our experience is just its outward expression. It's like an architect's blueprint before the building actually takes shape.
I think I'm starting to get this. So we need to form a clear mental image of what we want, but we need to hold it in our minds as if it's already real, as if it already exists.
Precisely. And it's interesting to note that this idea isn't unique to this material. It connects to concepts like Plato's archetypal ideas and Swedenborg's doctrine of correspondences, which both speak to this idea of a spiritual reality that underlies the physical world. It's like this ancient wisdom that keeps resurfacing in different forms throughout history. It makes you wonder if there's something to it, right? If this really is a fundamental principle of how reality works.
Yeah. And the material then brings in a powerful quote from the Bible, from the Gospel of Mark. It says, "All things whatsoever ye pray and ask for, believe that ye have received them, and ye shall receive them." Notice the emphasis on the past tense, have received. It's not will receive in the future.
Right. It's like the action is already complete.
Exactly. And that's the key to using our creative thought power effectively. We have to impress our desire onto the universal subjective mind as an already accomplished fact. And when we do that, we're operating on the plane of the absolute. We're bypassing all those considerations of limitations and conditions that tend to bog us down in the relative.
So by using our subjective minds consciously and intentionally, we're basically planting a seed in that fertile ground of the absolute. And once that seed is planted, it starts to draw everything it needs to grow and manifest in our experience.
Exactly. It attracts the resources, the circumstances, the opportunities, everything aligns to bring that initial intention into form.
It's like the law of attraction in action.
Very much so. And the material even draws a really interesting parallel with a scientific theory called the vortex ring theory.
Vortex ring theory. Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. What's that all about?
Well, this actually came from physicists, not metaphysicians. They were grappling with the fundamental nature of matter, trying to figure out what it's ultimately made of. And they proposed that it all might originate from these incredibly tiny, indestructible swirling rings of a primordial substance. These vortex rings, they theorized, are the basic building blocks of everything we perceive.
Whoa. So even physicists are considering the possibility of unseen forces shaping our reality.
Right. And what's really relevant for our conversation is that the core idea in this theory that tiny energetic nuclei can coalesce and attract to form larger, more complex manifestations, it echoes the very principle we've been discussing about the subjective mind. It's this idea of something unseen giving rise to the seen world.
It's like the seed analogy applied to physics. A tiny seed contains the potential for a whole tree. A tiny thought, held in the subjective mind, can manifest as a huge change in our lives.
Exactly. And that same principle plays out in biology too. Think about how a complex living organism develops from a single cell.
Right, like a human embryo. You start with this one tiny cell, and it divides and multiplies, eventually forming all the tissues and organs of a fully developed baby. It's amazing.
It really is. And whether we're looking at embryology or the way plants grow from seeds, the principle is the same. A small initial energetic center, a nucleus, leads to a complete form through this process of attraction and assimilation. It pulls in what it needs from its surroundings to grow and take shape.
So that begs the question, where does that initial nucleus come from? Like, what's the ultimate source of that organizing energy? What sparks that whole process into motion?
And here's where the material brings in a really thought-provoking quote from physicist J. Fleming. He said, and I'm paraphrasing a little here, that in its ultimate essence, energy is incomprehensible to us except as an expression of mind or will.
Wow. So even in physics, there's this acknowledgement that there might be something beyond the purely material realm, some kind of intelligence or consciousness that's driving the whole show.
It's a profound idea, isn't it? And it leads us to a pretty stunning conclusion. That the action of mind, our focused thought, is what plants that initial nucleus of potential. And when we allow that thought to take root in our subjective mind without being constantly undermined by doubt or conflicting suggestions, it naturally starts to attract the conditions needed for it to manifest in our experience.
So our thoughts really do create our reality, not in some magical instant manifestation kind of way, but in this very real dynamic process where our focused intentions set the stage for our experiences.
Exactly. Our thoughts are not just these passive things happening in our heads. They're powerful creative forces that shape the world around us.
So as we wrap up this contemplation, a few key takeaways really stand out. First, there's the incredible power of the subjective mind. It's constantly absorbing suggestions, shaping itself based on what we feed it, and acting on those suggestions to bring about corresponding results in our lives. Then there's this idea that our thoughts are active forces. They're not just passive mental events. They're the seeds of our experience. And finally, there's this crucial distinction between the subjective and the objective. We need both, but we have to be aware of how they interact and how they can influence our beliefs and our perception of reality.
And the most important takeaway of all is that understanding these principles puts us in the driver's seat. It empowers us to become conscious creators of our own experience. We're not just at the mercy of external circumstances. We have a vital role to play in shaping our inner and outer worlds. And it all starts with becoming aware of the power of our own minds and learning how to use that power intentionally and effectively.
Absolutely. We've got to think for ourselves about what we choose to believe. So here's a final thought-provoking question for you to contemplate as you go about your day. Considering how readily our subjective minds accept whatever they're presented with, what steps can you take to become more aware of the influences shaping your own beliefs? How can you cultivate a more discerning, objective approach to information? It's about becoming a conscious architect of your own mental landscape.
It's an ongoing process of learning and growth, but it's a journey well worth taking.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the workings of the subjective and objective mind. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep thinking for yourself.